It's the year 2050, and the world has changed dramatically from the 2020s and 2030s. Food production and consumption look entirely different than they did just 30 years ago. What brought about this monumental shift? It was a combination of environmental, health, and social factors that reached a tipping point in the late 2020s and necessitated major changes in the way we feed ourselves and society. In the early part of the 21st century, industrial agriculture and highly processed foods continued their dominance, leading to escalating rates of diet-related diseases like obesity and diabetes. Massive government subsidies enabled enormous monocrop farms and cheap fast food to proliferate, while making healthy, organic and sustainably grown food expensive and hard to access. At the same time, industrial farming practices like excessive plowing, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and overuse of water led to increasing degradation of farmland. Drought and growing water scarcity threatened food production in many regions. Public awareness was growing about the connections between industrialized food, environmental destruction, and poor health outcomes. But entrenched business interests and lack of political will prevented meaningful policy changes. That is, until the climate change crisis and global pandemic of the late 2020s sparked food shortages and disrupted supply chains. With hunger and food inequality worsening, and water and land use concerns mounting, the stage was set for major reforms. In 2030, the U.S. passed a revolutionary Green New Deal for food and agriculture. It enacted a carbon and water use tax on large farms and food companies, which helped fund the transition to regenerative methods. Subsidies shifted dramatically from big commodity crops like corn and soy to fruits, vegetables, and plant-based protein crops. Strict limits were placed on the use of synthetic chemicals and antibiotics in food production. Truth in labeling laws required packages to clearly state pesticide content, nutritional value, and environmental impact. At the same time, universal basic income programs made organic, local, and healthy foods affordable and accessible in low-income communities. Urban farms and community gardens blossomed in cities across America, providing fresher produce with lower carbon footprints. Investments into regional and seasonal agriculture reduced transport distances and reinvigorated rural economies. The fast food and meatpacking industries were forced to reinvent themselves, diversifying offerings and relying much less on factory farming. By 2040, the U.S. food system had been transformed into a more equitable, decentralized, and ecologically regenerative model. Family farms flourished again, and farmers adopted techniques like cover cropping, composting, conservation tillage, integrated pest management, and agroforestry. Crop diversity increased dramatically. Instead of just corn and soy covering the Midwest, small grains, legumes, fruits, and vegetables shared the landscape. Livestock herds were mixed and rotated on pastures for holistic grazing. Food production was integrated with natural ecosystems, increasing biodiversity, soil health, and water retention. On the consumer side, diets changed to focus on whole, minimally processed foods, mostly plants, supplemented by ethically raised animal products in moderation. Cooking from scratch became popular again, as did gardening and preserving food. Farmers' markets, food cooperatives, and community-supported agriculture provided local, seasonal produce directly to consumers. Supermarkets massively increased their plant-based offerings and promoted products with clean, green supply chains. A new generation came of age knowing nothing but this ecologically responsible, nutritious, and socially just food system. They could hardly imagine that just a few decades earlier, unhealthy processed food dominated the industrialized landscape, and only the wealthy could afford ethical, sustainable meals. Now every child learned through school gardening programs how soil, plants, animals, and humans all connect in the web of life to nourish each other. It became natural to consider the environmental and health impacts of food choices. Terms like food miles, Monocropping, CAFOs, and pesticide treadmills that once seemed obscure became common knowledge. The road to get there wasn't easy. Entrenched interests fought back against what they saw as radical reforms that threatened their profits and way of life. Farmers struggled to adapt and overhaul practices. Many smaller food companies couldn't make the transition in time. Consumers had to learn new shopping and cooking habits, and prices rose temporarily while the market adjusted. But in the end, most agreed the sacrifices were worth it for the benefits to long-term food security, ecological sustainability, rural economies, nutrition, and public health. By mid-century, the U.S. had become a model for sustainable food systems. Countries across the world followed with their own Green New Deal policies to address environmental degradation, diet-related disease, food insecurity, and inequality. International cooperation and technology sharing enabled rapid replication of regenerative techniques everywhere from South Asia to Latin America. A global movement was underway, recognizing access to healthy, sustainable food as a human right for all. So while the road was difficult, society moved decisively to align food production and consumption with ecological limits and human needs. The crisis convergence of the late 2020s tipped the balance of power, allowing real systemic change. Of course, new challenges continue arising as climate change impacts worsen. But the food system transformations made society more resilient, adaptable, and healthy overall, while massively reducing agriculture's burden on the planet. This generation takes for granted what previous ones could barely imagine: an abundant, equitable, and ecologically regenerative food system that feeds everyone sustainably. It goes to show that when enough people demand change, even entrenched systems can shift dramatically and for the better. Subscribe.